In the last clip with dates and times, you saw me use the typeOf function to find out what kind of type I was working with. Let's continue on and find out some of the base types here from RethinkDB. And I'll be interspersing some of the documentation from RethinkDB's website. And the first thing we'll start with is tables. Pretty obvious here. They store data and you can write to them. So we already know this because we specified .table, and that is a table. No surprising thing here. But what about something like concat-map? You've seen me use concat-map before. What does it return? Well, let's do what we've been doing before, and we'll return the albums. And you can see it's a type of stream. What's a stream? Well, that's what you're going to be working with quite often when you do a query with filter or returning an array with concat-map. It just returns a cursor. It doesn't return the entire result set. And this is really helpful if you're bringing back a big result set that you want to loop over. And you can loop over it right in your client application in the same way you would do it in the Data Explorer. So those are streams, and it's really important to know when you're working with them. But there is a slight difference if you're using filter. Let's take a look. And for this, I'll just return the album ID that is equal to 2. And what I'm most interested in is, there we go, the type that is returned, which is a selection of type stream. That's a generic if you've never seen it. So what is that? Well, selection represents a subset of tables. So that's easy to understand. And so if we use filter, we get that subset, and it's returned to us as a stream. But there's two kinds of selections. There's an object selection, which is just one record, and there's a stream selection, which returns a bunch. And so in our case, we got a stream selection. Why didn't we get an object selection when we asked for one record using album ID of 2? Well, because we didn't use get. We used filter, and filter returns a selection of type stream. Okay, so let's do something a little bit easier. What if we did count? What does count return? Well, that's good news. It's just a basic number. However, this is the part where type enthusiasts out there are going to say, how are the numbers stored? And they are stored as double precision or 64-bit floating point numbers internally. This means that if you're doing anything with numbers that requires deep precision, decimal places and so on, well, floating point arithmetic is going to be a bit of an issue for you, so just be aware of that. All right, well, let's take a look at the ID here. And as I mentioned before, all the IDs generated by RethinkDB are stored as GUIDs or UUIDs. If we use a get and use that ID, what do we have? Well, as I mentioned before, we have a selection of an object. This is not using filter, so that would be a selection of a stream. This is just selection of an object. If I use pluck on here, you might expect this to be a string. After all, it's just the name. But it's not, because it returns name and then the value. So it's actually an object. Which brings to mind that the core data types that are in RethinkDB are the basic JavaScript types, with the exception of date. But there are objects, there are arrays, there are numbers, and there are strings. And everything else gets coerced into one of those. You can then spin up from there using the pseudotypes that are in RethinkDB. We'll take a look at those more in depth later on. But what about the document's ID? I mentioned before that it was generated, and here you can see that ID. It's a big fat GUID, and it's stored as a string. I guess no surprise there. If I ask for a string field, in this case status, and I ask for the type, it's a string. So again, no surprise there. Strings, numbers, arrays, objects. And let's take a look at one last example here just to reiterate this. If I say r.now, which returns the current date and time, you can see down below it's a pseudotype or a p-type, a pseudotype of time. And that's what we tried to work with in the last clip, and it was a little bit confusing. But the good news is that there's easy ways to work with it. And if you read the documentation on time, well, then you know that the drivers, the JavaScript, Ruby, or Python drivers, will automatically convert those dates and times for you for your client to consume, even though they might not be stored with those specific types in the database.